Memorial Day actually was originally called Decoration Day because in the Civil War, after Civil War, people would go and decorate the graves of the Civil War soldiers that died, either the Union Army or Confederate. And in the early 20th century, they decided to change it and make it for everybody who died in military service. Last month, I wanted to have a great Memorial Day program, and unfortunately, my mind wasn't thinking when I scheduled it, and I scheduled it for 2 days after Memorial Day. I should have scheduled it last week, but we're going to have it this week because we couldn't change last week because of the teachers. And I went up and had lunch with Leo last month up in Leo Croce, our member, up at his home, up at his, where he lives in Walnut Creek. And I wanted him to be the speaker. And he said, well, I already gave a program a few years ago. And he gave me a DVD of this talk. And I took it home, and it was so terrific. I thought, God, this would be great just to hear that talk again. It's been 10 years. I don't think anybody remembers what he said 10 years ago. And I gave the DVD to Alan Frank. And we want to give Alan a big round of applause because Alan has worked very hard to get this to project today. So please. For those of you who are fairly new to the club, I want to tell you about our member, Leo Croce. Leo was born in Oakland in 1923, and he went to high school in Oakland, and in 1941, in September, he started classes at Berkeley on an alumni freshman scholarship. In December of 1942, he volunteered for the Army Air Corps, and in March of 1944, he won his pilot wings and was commissioned as second lieutenant and assigned to B-17 bomber group in England. He's going to tell you all about that and what he experienced during World War II. When he got out of the service, he went back to Berkeley. In 1948, he got his degrees, and he started teaching in the Oakland Public School. In 25 years in Oakland, he served as a teacher, a coach, a counselor, a vice principal, a junior high school principal, a high school principal, and an associate superintendent. He wanted me to tell you all that. In 1973, he came to Livermore as the superintendent of schools, and he served in that capacity for 16 years, the longest of anybody who's ever been a superintendent of schools in Livermore. In 1992, the school board dedicated a new school in Leo's name, the Leo Croce Elementary School. And Leo donated a $10,000 scholarship to start a scholarship. Every year he gives $5,000 to that scholarship for that school, and so far they've raised $60,000 for scholarships. He has his own consulting company now. And in 1948, he married his beautiful wife, Tina, and he met her in the 7th grade. Leo joined our club in 1973, 42 years ago, and now he's 92 years old. I thought he was 92 years old when he joined the club. So, we're going to have a wonderful video presentation from Leo on the talk he gave 10 years ago, and then Leo's going to come up and address us after the talk. So, Alan, please start.
Very good. Please be seated.
Before I forget,
Our
this is a
program
great book.
today is to commemorate Memorial
Get from
Day, which is
Amazon.
actually going to be celebrated on Monday, May 29th. It's unfortunate that so many people see Memorial Day as just another day off, a 3-day holiday. Kids get a day off from school, government offices closed, some businesses closed. But Bart still runs his full schedule, and the big stores will be advertising their mammoth, colossal Memorial Day sales. Now, I don't expect all of us to wear sackcloth and black veils because it's Memorial Day. I'm certainly not going to do that. I'm going to enjoy the day, and I hope you do too. But you know, that should be a day that is one of the most important and solemn days of the year in our country. Memorial Day is intended as a day to pause and remember and to give thanks to those men and women who sacrificed their lives for all 300 million of us here in America, in our beautiful America, so that we can enjoy our freedoms, our liberty, our quality of life, and a wide range of the opportunities that we all expect and that we all enjoy. Freedom is not free. It has too often come at the priceless cost of human lives. Since our Revolutionary War 230 years ago, You know, remember the Maine, remember the Alamo, the great devastating Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Grenada, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq, a total of 12 wars, including the Revolutionary War. It has been determined that we have lost about 1,200,000 Americans who gave their lives in trying to bring to us our freedoms and to protect those freedoms that we have now. Envied by other people in the world, but sometimes with malice. Within our Rotary Club, we have our own people who participated in some of these conflicts. And I know it's not Veterans Day, but I'd like all of you guys to please stand up for a minute. Please stand up. Let's give them a round of applause. Our lucky ones, we're the ones who did not have to make that supreme sacrifice. We were able to come home. And I thank the Almighty for that each day, and I'm sure that you do too, or you should. I would imagine that probably many people in this room today have been touched by relatives, friends, schoolmates who sacrificed their lives during one of these wars for our freedom. Unfortunately, freedom is not free. Throughout the history of this nation, our leaders have stepped forward to take action to protect our liberties and our freedoms. The actions have not always been popular. Benjamin Franklin, for example, and his stepson, they were on opposite sides of the Revolutionary War. But in the end, the overall outcome of these historical events is that in one way or another we have preserved our America the Beautiful. We should never forget our fragile freedom, how fragile our freedoms are, and we should never forget the sacrifices that others have made on our behalf. Memorial Day is a very close and personal day for me. As you know, I was a combat pilot in World War II. And that war was one of the greatest conflicts that the world has known. There were more people in uniform from more countries than had ever been before, and or has the world seen since. America had 16 million people in uniform during that conflict. I flew a B-17 heavy bomber flying, B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy bomber in the U.S. Army 8th Air Force in England, and I flew 35 missions to complete my combat tour in the European theater of war. Now, I'm not prone to tell war stories or even discuss my war experiences. As a matter of fact, my family doesn't even know what I'm going to be saying here today. But since I'm here and it's Memorial Day and I've been asked to do this, I'm going to give you some of the personal statistics and data. I want to share some of that with you. So as I relate some of this stuff to you, you'll understand why Memorial Day has a particular special meaning for me. Casualties. The 8th Army Air Force, of which I was a member, suffered the greatest percentage of loss of all of the other military branches combined. They had 22% of the people killed in action, 23% of the people missing in action. 1 out of every 5 Americans killed in World War II worldwide was a bomber crew member in Europe. 1 of 6 Americans in all branches of the military that were killed in the European theater of action were pilots and crew members of the 8th Air Force. Some deadly statistics. The 303rd Heavy Bombardment Group, B-17s, arrived in England on August of 1942. In 3 months, they flew 11 missions. They lost 50% of their air personnel, 175 people, and 120% of their bombers. The 306th Bomb Group arrived in England in October of 1942 with 35 air crews. 27 were shot down, only 7 completed the then mandatory 25 missions. On October 10th through the 14th of 1943, the Air Force on those 3 days carried out raids, and they lost 100 bombers in those 3 raids. With 10 people on a crew in those days, that was 1,000 people in 3 days. My bomb group was the 398th Bomb Group. We were also in England, the European theater of war. My group arrived over in England on May of 1944 and stayed there until the end of hostilities in April of 1945. My crew and I were a replacement crew, and we went over and we arrived at the 398th Bomb Group in England in August of 1944. The As John said, I flew my first mission on September 5th of 1944 and completed my mission by flying number 35 on January 1st of 1945. In our group, we had 31% loss of people killed in action, prisoners of war, or missing in action. By my 12th mission of the 35 that we had to perform, my crew was the senior crew of the 15 crews of our squadron. On 12 of my missions, that's 1/3, 34%, about one every third mission I went on, our group lost a bomber from fighter planes and aircraft or mechanical problems. So as I look around the room, there are 13 tables here, and if you all put up your hands if you would. And if I went around the table on every third mission that I was on and say, put your hand down, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, 30, 33, 36. No hands are up. That was the number of people that were lost during that time. Can't remember all the paper up here. You know, the good Lord would have it, even though I'm talking about some of these statistics, if the good Lord would have it, my crew survived 100%. Nobody was killed in action. We had no severe wounds from anybody in our crew, so we were very fortunate. And yet we were on mission where we had major damage to our airplane. Fuselage damage, our oxygen system shot out, came back 2 or 3 times with one engine missing, came back one time with 2 engines missing and had to make an emergency landing. So we had to limp home on some of those missions. Several of you here have asked me to share what it's like to be a bomber pilot for one day. So these are statistics of what had happened, but let me tell you what a day of a bomber pilot is like. When we go on a mission ordinarily, you know, that was 62 years ago that I did this. So some of it I remember, a lot of it I forgot, and I think there's some that I don't want to remember. So let me share some of that with you. First of all, air raid, spelled backwards, is diarrhea. You told me you were leaving early. And I know a lot of pilots who will attest to that. Each night we'd go to our mess hall or the officers club or wherever, the squadron room, and look at the bulletin board to see if we were scheduled to fly a mission, if the squadron was going. Then you'd look to see if your crew was scheduled to go with that squadron. If you were, when you got back to your Quonset hut, and there were pilot, co-pilot, navigator of each crew in the Quonset hut, and there were 4 cruisers or 12 people in there. You tie a towel on the end of your Army cot, which also happened to have your name on the cot. About 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd have a flashlight flashing in your face, and it would be somebody from operations telling you, and this is what he would say, he'd say, breakfast at 3, briefing at 4. So we had to get up quietly because everybody in the hut did not necessarily go on each mission. You get up, you clean up, you get dressed, you hike across the cold, dark morning to the mess hall, and you have a breakfast of powdered eggs, powdered milk, coffee and tea, toast, and I ate very lightly, and I'll tell you why later. And then we had the option stopping by the chaplain's place. That's one stop I did not miss. I went every time, I'll let you know that. Then we'd have to go to the squadron room to get dressed in our combat gear, and let me tell you what that entailed. First of all, we had to take off all the uniform that we had already put on because we had to wear the uniform to get into the mess hall. So then we put on long johns. The reason we put on long johns, when you're flying about 5 miles up there, the degree is about minus 35 to minus 55 degrees below zero. Very, very cold. So we would put on an electric flight suit, electrically heated flight suit. Trouble with that is that the electrically heated flight suit sometimes would get shorted out, or if you lost your electrical system, you had no heat. So we put on that suit. Then we would strap onto ourselves a .45 caliber pistol. That was in case we had to bail out or got shot down, so we'd have something to defend ourselves if we needed that. The reason we wore it inside, if you jumped out of your plane and popped the parachute and you had that on the outside, you'd lose it. So we have the heating suit on, we have the gun on us down. So now we put on a fleece-lined leather flying jacket. Then we put on a fleece-lined leather flying pants. And then we put on fleece-lined leather flying boots. And then we put on silk gloves and then fleece-lined leather gloves on top of that. Then we put on a fleece-lined leather helmet with our earphone plugs in there. And then we would put on our goggles. And then we would put on a Mae West preserve jacket, you know, they show you in the airplane what to do in case you go down the water. Then we would put on our parachute harness. And then we would snap on our oxygen mask. Then when we got to the airplane, we would put on a flat vest, which is like a bulletproof vest. And then when in flight, we had to wear a steel helmet. We looked like some clumsy bunch of nuts out there when we'd be walking out to our airplanes. So, following that, after we got all that gear on, at 4 a.m., we would go to the briefing room. Pilot, co-pilots would go to one briefing, navigators to another, radio men to another, gunners to another briefing, and everybody get information that they needed to make that mission success. Pilot, co-pilots, when we walked into our briefing room, the operations officer would be up on the stage like I am now and very dramatically would pull back the curtain, just like you see in the movies. He'd pull back the curtain and you'd see a map of Europe, and there'd be a piece of yarn showing you what our flight was going to be, what the initial point was before the target and the target itself, and then the route that we would be flying home. Along with that, they talked to us about the target. We had to find out what our plane position would be in our squadron formation and what our squadron would fit into the group formation and the group formation into the wing formation. Very complicated process. We had to find out how we would assemble to be able to do all of that. We had to know our radio frequencies, the code names that would be used, the estimated time of arrival at various checkpoints along the target line, the altitude changes that we would have during that mission, weather conditions, information of possible enemy fighter attacks, areas of anti-aircraft fire, and then finally when we walked out the door, they gave us a plastic sealed escape kit, which had in it a silk map of the area in which we would be flying, had some concentrated foods that you could eat and live for a day or two, a compass and a few other items in there. So after we finished that, we would be ready to go out to our planes. It'd be about 5 o'clock. A truck would pick us all up and take us out to the aircraft, and same with the other members of the crew, we'd all meet at our plane. So once we got there, we talked to the ground crew chief, who had been probably up all night working on the airplanes, making sure that the engines were ready to go, that any damage from the day before had been repaired, loaded the airplane with fuel, helped the ordnance people load the bombs that we were going to carry. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, I called the crew together, we would meet. Before we got back into the plane, we talked about that mission to make sure everybody knew what their job was going to be. We talked about the discipline on the radio so that we knew exactly what we were going to do. Pardon me. Next, I'd tell them all to go behind the bushes and relieve themselves. The reason I would do that was because you're going to be in the air from 6 to 9 hours. You've been up since 2 o'clock in the morning. You've got all that gear on. You're going to be up 5 miles above the earth in sub-freezing weather, and it's pretty damn hard to take care of your bodily functions when you're going through all of that. That's why I ate a light breakfast. After that, we get into the plane and get into our positions, the bombardier and the toggler in the nose, the 2 pilots on the flight deck, the flight engineer standing behind us, the radio man behind the bomb bay bulkhead with all the equipment he needed. Underneath him, the ball turret man, when he got in there, his feet were level with his ears, and he stayed that way for 6 to 9 hours. Then the waist gunner, who had to stand by open windows, not closed, in that 30, 40 minus degree weather. And then, of course, the tail gunner who sat at the back of the plane to see where we'd been, not where we were going. The next thing we would do, we'd wait for the signals to tell us to start our engine, which was usually a yellow flare from the control tower. We'd get our engine started to go through the checklist on our planes to make sure that everything was set and ready to go. Then at a prescribed time and a prescribed procedure, we would taxi out for takeoff area. We would wait for the green flare from the control tower, and we would take off, and the takeoff plane would be about every 30 or 45 seconds, one following the other. The next thing we had to do, probably between 7 and 8 o'clock, would be to get ourselves into formation before we could take off and go to the target. So just in our group alone, we probably had 36 planes, heavy bombers going up, usually, as you will attest, Michael, through the clouds and the fog of England, and getting up above, and then beginning circling around our radio beacon called the Buncher, and our leaders, our squad leaders, would be flying around and shooting a designated color of flares. And each of us would fly around and we'd catch up with them so that we were in formation with them. The dangerous part was not only our 36 planes, but this was being repeated by other groups all around us in that section of England. So there were hundreds of airplanes up in the air at the same time. So it was a very dangerous time. We hadn't even started the mission yet, just trying to get going. We're climbing all the time while we did that. And when everybody is in formation, it's very much like we do for the rodeo parade. Everybody has a spot to be when you're supposed to be there at a certain time, and then they take off. The first group goes in, then the second, the third. So the parade starts. We get the English Channel about at 10,000 or 15,000 feet. We're lowering our oxygen mask now because you have to put them on at 10,000 feet. We did not have pressurized cabins like you ride in now, or padded airplanes that you ride, or upholstery on the floor, or upholstered seats, or air conditioning, or movies in flight. The skin you saw on the outside of the airplane was the skin we saw on the inside of the airplane, with the rivets that rose to the river hopefully put in there correctly. So we could take off on the mission, begin flying towards our target. As I said, this dance we did up there would continue for maybe an hour and a half. And so we'd take off for the target, and we would arrive at our target about 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We'd come to the IP, which was the initial point. And the purpose of the initial point was for all of the plane, or your plane, to get itself under real control, because you are now going to turn it over to the bombardier. And you had to fly that plane at a constant speed, at a constant altitude. You couldn't divert either way in a constant direction. So you went from the IP to the target doing this, and all the anti-aircraft people down there see you as a sitting duck. It took about 5 or 6 minutes of this flight to get to the target. 5 or 6 years, really. And so when you get there, what would happen, the bomb bay doors would be open, the bombardier would get everything lined up on his sights down there, he'd release the bombs, and we'd love to hear bombs away. And the next line was, let's get the hell out of here. Then we come back on our route flight home, and we get back to our base about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And again, when we get out of the plane and meet with the ground crew man, talking about the things that we thought were wrong with the plane or needed some attention, that kind of thing. And then we would go to the interrogation room. Pilots and navigators in the interrogation, each crew had a table like we're sitting here. You had an interrogation officer who would ask you a multitude of questions about the raid. What did you see? Did any of our bombers go down? Where do you think they were when they went down? Did you see any fighter planes? Did they attack you? How did they attack you? From the top, from the bottom, from the side? Did they come in mass? Did they come one at a time? What about the anti-aircraft fire? Was it heavy, light, medium? What kind of tracking pattern did it have? Where were those places where you thought it was the heaviest? When you bombed the target, were you able to see it after you hit it? All these questions so that they could then be prepared and maybe giving us a better chance for the next time we went out on a mission. While this was going on, and while the briefing is going on, there would be members of the Red Cross or the medical staff of the base would be coming around with trays. One would be a tray with coffee and tea and cigarettes. I'd never smoked before, but I started. And so they would come by and coffee, tea, and the cigarettes, and then would come a tray with shots of whiskey on it. You had to sign a paper that said this is for medicinal purposes. Some of the guys, they had a bottle with them, and they wouldn't drink their drink. They'd put it in the bottle because they were going to have a celebration when they finished their 35th mission. Being a little bit aware of statistics, we drank all of ours each time. When we finished with the interrogation, we then went back to the squad room. That would be sometime after 4 o'clock, between 4 and 5. and we get out of that combat gear, take all that stuff off that I talked about and put it back in the locker. And I have to tell you, pilots, crew get to be very superstitious after they have a few successful missions. Those long johns last for 35 missions without seeing the washing machine. So we get all good of that gear, get back into our regular uniform. By this time it's close to 6 o'clock. We trudge across the dark and cold to the mess hall, and we had to wear a necktie to the mess hall. Our commanding officer, John P. Hunter, was a West Point graduate and a very proper officer, so we had to wear a necktie. Even though you just come back from a long mission, had to wear a necktie. He was really a great guy, though, and sad to say that Colonel Hunter was shot down and killed in action the day after I finished my last mission. So you see that a mission is quite a long, tense day for us. You get up in the morning and you don't get back until 4 or 5 in the afternoon when you're through with everything. During that time you have to put on your oxygen mask. When you hit 10,000 feet, go on up from there. We fly from 24,000 to 30,000 feet. Very cold up there, and you had to make sure that your oxygen mask did not ice up. It was your lifeline connected to the plane with your electrical system and your radio system. So we'd be on that oxygen mask from 9 o'clock in the morning till maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoons. That's 4 or 5 hours of wearing that very uncomfortable but life-saving device. During that time, we had to be on the constant lookout for fighters that might be coming in, for fighter attacks. We were flying through anti-aircraft fire. 105 millimeter missiles, 88s. We had to check with our crew every 15 minutes to make sure that they're on oxygen, that they were okay. If they saw any damage to the plane, anything else they saw out there that would be important for us to see. Check with the navigator every 15 minutes. I wanted to know what our location was, what heading we had, and if we had to go back on our own, what heading would we take going back should the navigator get shot, killed, incapacitated. You know, the pilots are responsible for getting their crew back home. So that was important too. Now all this is going on while we're flying a 65,000-pound airplane up there with 4,800 horsepower whirling out there in front of us with 10,000 pounds of bombs and 2,700 to 3,000 gallons of high-octane fuel stored in our vulnerable wings out there and some tanks inside next to the bomb bay. So what we tried to do was to fly in a very close formation. Because the closer formation that we flew, B-17 has 13 50 caliber machine guns on it around, that's why I call it the Flying Fortress. The closer the formation would fly, less chance of enemy planes coming through. They'd have to come from outside. We'd have real firepower at that point. So the trick was to fly as close as you can. Not easy. We would fly so close to the plane next to us, we could read the dials on their instrument panel. I kid you not. And that's hard work. You're fighting that wheel, you're jockeying the 4 throttles, paying attention to what's going on, listening to the radio instructions that are coming in. It was so tense and tiring that we used to change every 15 minutes. The pilot would fly for 15 minutes, and then the co-pilot would fly for 15 minutes, and back and forth for the whole mission. Now, during that 15 minutes, it didn't mean that you sat there and did nothing. You were the guy who then called up the crew and checked on their oxygen, any damage in the plane, you checked with the navigator to get our location, our direction. You did all the radio stuff that you had to do. So you were busy all the time. And of course, I told you what it was like when we got to the initial point before we hit the target. That tragic 5 or 6 minutes that we had to fly straight, level, constant speed before we got into the target and just waited for the guy to say, hey, bombs away. A mission took 6 to 9 hour flight time, depending upon where we went. We often zigzagged across Europe to confuse the enemy of what our actual target would be, and also to attract enemy fighter planes to come up from the ground to attack us. Because we had our fighter escorts now by that time who go way out there with us, and they wanted to engage the enemy in aerial combat, because the more German planes we got rid of, the safer it was for the bombers, and we had air supremacy over Europe. So we were kind of used as guinea pigs, if you will, to get the other people up there. Sometimes we would have to fly 3 missions on 3 consecutive days. That doesn't sound like much. You go to work 3 days in a row like nothing. But if you go back and think of the hours of the time that you're up from 2 o'clock in the morning until get back about 5. You don't sleep very well when you get back that night. So it was very difficult. Sometimes we'd have to find four missions in 5 days. So you see, for us flyboys, as we were known over in England, we weren't so glamorous as they try to portray us to be in the movies. But you know, when you're 21 years old, it's frightfully exhilarating. The adrenaline flows. It's very exciting. You know that you're immortal. Maybe the other as well. And you know that you're invincible. And if you're smart enough, you know you're pretty damn scared. Well, that's enough about me. At each of your tables today, you'll see a miniature American flag. I'm wearing one. Would you all please take one? I'm going to ask you something. I'm going to ask that each of you will proudly pin that flag on your lapel or your dress or your skirt or your blouse on next Monday, which is Memorial Day. Even if it's for a few minutes, so that your spouse or your soulmate sees it, or the guy at the gas station sees it, or the clerk at the store. And let that just be a simple act to remind us and those around us that it's just not another day off, another big shopping day. Let it be a reminder to celebrate the lives of those heroes and those men and women who made that supreme sacrifice so that we can enjoy our lives, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness. I know that all of you out there are not flag wavers, but you can tell that I certainly am one. But I know you're still very, very patriotic. So I'm going to ask you for just this one day, pin that little flag on you for just a little part of the time so you can remember to yourself and other people that it is Memorial Day, so that we can honor and appreciate our fallen heroes. Remembering when we do that freedom is not free. So for this Memorial Day, let's put aside all of our ideologies and our political positions about war and pay homage to those people who fought and died in our 230-year history for our democratic way of life and for our cherished liberties and our freedoms. And now I'd like to ask all of the members, Rotary members who were veterans that stood up before, please come up with me at the stand.
Leo, this
It's really loud.
Okay. They cut the film off, but in the film it says, I'd like to close the program with a poem that was written by a man named Kevin Whitaker from England. He was a friend of the 398th Bomb Group, our association since the war's over. And I'd like to share that with you, and I'll read it to you today. It's entitled, Why Do You March, Old Man? Why do you march, old man, with medals on your chest? Why do you weep, old man, for comrades you laid to rest? And why do your eyes gleam so when you hear those trumpets blow? And why do you still grieve for a war of long ago? You seek answers from me, young man? It's by good grace that this warrior's old. We were once like you, young man, of youth, and yes, quite bold. And in our youth, we heard those notes of the battle bugle call. They put silver wings on our chests and hoped we would not fall. I'll tell you why I march, young man, with medals on my chest. I'll tell you why I weep, young man, for comrades laid to rest. Through misty eyes of long ago come visions of days gone by, when boys of tender youth flew forth from a fiery sky. Yes, we buried them in blanket shroud, the young flesh burned and blackened. A communal grave newly gorged of blood-stained earth and bracken. You ask me why I march, young man? I march to remind you all. But for these grave and fallen men, you would never have known freedom at all. Thank you.
inspiring.
Wasn't that a great program? For those of you who want to know more about what Leo experienced, this is a great book about the 8th Artillery Wing in World War II in England. You can get it off Amazon, called Masters of the Air. It's only $14. So if you want to read a great book about World War II history, this is one to read.
Hey Leo, do you have time for questions? Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Leo?
Yeah, what was the base you were at in England, Leo?
So you just need to like right here.
Question?
What was the base, the name of the base?
We were at Nevenstead. It's about 20 miles north of London and 10 miles south of Cambridge. A lot of airplanes based throughout there with a 398 bomber.
Did you lose 2 engines on one side or one on each?
2 on one side, very difficult. By the way, I don't want to be like Brian Williams. I was a co-pilot, not a pilot. So. But I did my job. John,
On the weather, taking off and flying in formation and landing, what do you do? How do you handle the weather?
How do you handle the weather and taking off and flying?
well, of course we got all kinds of weather reports before we left. Sometimes we'd be on the flight line ready to go when the weather would close in and we'd have to sit there for a couple hours, which is worse than being on the mission, you can imagine, waiting to go. And then we would go. Many times by the time you were 100 feet off the ground, you were in the fog, that English fog, and maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet before you break out of the top. Now you remember what I said, there are hundreds of planes getting up into their formation, so you're flying in this fog now, and you can't look around and see who's there. You're just depending upon your instruments, so you're doing the same thing you're supposed to do, and then you pop out of there and you look around again, and you thank God that you made it to the top of the mission that even started.
Did you take off on grass?
What?
Grass.
No, we had a macadam runway. Yes.
Were all the missions daytime missions?
Yes. The strategy of the war was the RAF was flying night missions over Germany. Nighttime, couldn't see the targets very well and so on. So they decided they wanted to do some daylight bombing, and so the Americans said, we'll take on the daylight bombing job. And there was very good, big questions about whether that could be successful or not. You can understand that if they're daylight, could really see with the radar and so on. So they started with that, and the statistics I gave you of some of the first crews that were over there, it was just devastating. They didn't have any fighter planes covering them because they couldn't go far out into the enemy territory. So there were very, very big losses. About 75% of them, they had about a 75% chance of being shot down, killed in those early days. In my days, it was easier, it's only 1/3 chance, so better.
Thank you, Leo.
We have a sergeant, military sergeant back there. Tell us what you are.
I wore my father's shirt. He was in the Army Air Corps during World War II. And he never, thank goodness, went on missions 3 different times. He was in training programs, and the night before the mission was to leave the next morning, it was called off. But he trained to be a navigator and a tail gunner.
Love to see
And
you.
he was just a sergeant.
Love to see that. And thank you for that wonderful poem.